the dusty frontier towns of 1880s Montana, where men outnumbered women 10 to 1, a single letter could change everything. For Eleanor Hartwell, that letter was supposed to be her salvation, a chance to escape the suffocating expectations of Boston society and find love on her own terms. But when she stepped off that creaking stagecoach into the harsh mountain air, clutching her carpetbag and a faded photograph of her intended husband, she had no idea that within 3 days she'd be standing in the town square, publicly rejected and humiliated. With nowhere to go, and winter approaching fast, what she couldn't have known was that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with acceptance, but with rejection, and that the quiet man watching from the shadows of the general store would see in her trembling hands and downcast eyes not weakness, but a strength that could tame the wildest frontier and heal the deepest wounds. Eleanor Hartwell pressed her gloved hands against the rough wooden seat of the stagecoach as it bounced violently over another rut in the mountain road. Dust swirled through the small windows, coating her navy blue traveling dress and settling in her carefully pinned auburn hair. She had been traveling for 6 days now, first by train from Boston to Denver, then by this bone-jarring coach through the Colorado Rockies toward the small mining town of Silver Creek, Montana Territory. In her lap sat a worn leather portfolio containing everything that had led to this moment. The carefully written letters between herself and Thomas Mitchell, a prosperous rancher who had advertised for a wife in the Boston Herald. His photograph showed a stern-faced man with dark hair and serious eyes, standing beside a wooden fence with mountains in the background. His letters had been polite, practical, describing his ranch and his need for a companion who could manage a household and bear children. Eleanor had responded with her own photograph and letters detailing her education, her ability to cook and sew, and her desire for a simple life away from the social pressures of Boston society. At 24, Eleanor was considered past her prime by Boston standards. Her mother had died when she was 16, leaving her to care for her increasingly frail father, a struggling bookkeeper who spent most of his earnings on whiskey. When he died the previous spring, Eleanor found herself alone in the world with barely enough money to pay for his burial. The choice had seemed simple: become a governess for some wealthy family, forever at the mercy of others' whims, or answer one of the many advertisements for mail-order brides that filled the newspapers. She had chosen Thomas Mitchell because his letters were the most literate and his ranch sounded prosperous. He had promised to pay her travel expenses and provide a comfortable home. What more could a woman in her position hope for? The stagecoach driver's shout interrupted her thoughts. "Silver Creek coming up, miss. Better gather your things." Eleanor's stomach tightened with nervous excitement. Through the dust-covered window, she could see wooden buildings clustered along a wide dirt street. The town was smaller than she had imagined, perhaps 24 structures in all, dominated by what appeared to be a large mine operation on the hillside above. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily business. The coach lurched to a stop in front of a building marked Silver Creek Hotel and Saloon. Eleanor gathered her carpetbag and the small trunk that contained all her worldly possessions. The driver climbed down and offered her a weathered hand to help her descend. "You be careful now, miss," he said kindly. "This is rough country, but the folks are mostly good people. You got someone meeting you?" "Yes," Eleanor replied, smoothing her skirts and looking around anxiously. "Mr. Thomas Mitchell. He owns a ranch nearby." The driver nodded. "Know Tom well. Good man. He'll be along shortly, I reckon. Best you wait inside the hotel where it's proper." Eleanor thanked him and made her way toward the hotel entrance, keenly aware of the curious stares from several men lounging on the wooden sidewalk. She kept her eyes down, clutching her bag tighter. This was exactly why she had been so careful in her letters to Thomas, to emphasize her modest, quiet nature. Men in the wilderness surely needed wives who wouldn't cause trouble or draw unwanted attention. The hotel lobby was small but clean, with a few chairs arranged around a stone fireplace. A middle-aged woman behind the wooden counter looked up as Eleanor entered. "You must be the bride," the woman said with a knowing smile. "I'm Mrs. Patterson. Tom Mitchell told me to expect you today. He's been quite the nervous bridegroom, I can tell you." "I'm Eleanor Hartwell," she replied softly. "Is Mr. Mitchell here?" "He'll be along presently." "Why don't you sit by the fire and I'll fetch you some coffee? You look worn out from that terrible road." Eleanor accepted gratefully and settled into one of the chairs. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed her gloves. Everything depended on the next few hours. If Thomas approved of her in person, they would be married within the week. If not, she pushed the thought away. There was no point in dwelling on that possibility. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it helped steady her nerves. Through the window, she watched the busy street. Men in work clothes emerged from what appeared to be a mining office, their faces blackened with coal dust. A woman in a faded dress carried a basket toward a general store. Everything looked so different from Boston's brick buildings and manicured parks. This was a working town, a place where people fought daily against the harsh environment to scratch out a living. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden porch made her look up. The door opened and a tall man in a brown suit entered, removing his hat to reveal dark hair touched with grey at the temples. Eleanor recognized him immediately from his photograph, though he looked older and more weathered in person. "Miss Hartwell?" His voice was deep and careful. "Yes." She rose quickly, smoothing her skirts again. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm pleased to finally meet you." Thomas Mitchell studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in every detail of her appearance. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush under his scrutiny. She was not a beautiful woman, she knew that. Her features were pleasant but unremarkable, her figure average. She had always been told she had lovely eyes, a deep green that seemed to change color in different light, but she doubted that would matter much to a practical rancher.
"You're smaller than I expected," he said finally.
"I'm sorry if that disappoints you. I tried to be accurate in describing myself. And quieter, much quieter." There was something in his tone that made her stomach clench with worry. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat. "Perhaps you two would like to speak privately? There's a small parlor just off the dining room." Thomas nodded and gestured for Eleanor to follow him. The parlor was barely larger than a closet, with two chairs facing each other across a small table. When they were seated, Thomas leaned back and studied her again. "Your letters were very proper," he said. "Very reserved." "I believe in conducting myself appropriately, Mr. Ray." "Mitchell." "Tom. Call me Tom." He was silent for a moment, seemingly lost in thought. "Tell me about yourself, Eleanor. What do you like to do? What makes you happy?" The question surprised her. She had expected him to ask about her domestic skills or her health. "I enjoy reading," she said carefully, "and I find satisfaction in keeping a well-ordered household. I believe I would be content managing your home and being a good wife to you." "Content." He repeated the word as if it left a bad taste in his mouth. "What about conversation? Do you enjoy talking with people? Entertaining guests?" Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her. These were not the questions of a man pleased with what he saw. "I prefer quieter pursuits, I'm afraid. I'm not much for social gatherings." Thomas was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to fidget with her gloves. Finally, he leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "Eleanor, you seem like a fine woman, a good woman, but I don't think we would suit each other." The words hit her like a physical blow. "I don't understand. Have I done something wrong? Said something inappropriate?" "No, nothing like that." Tom ran a hand through his hair. "It's just, well, I realize now that I wasn't entirely honest in my letters. I wrote them when I was feeling lonely and thinking I needed just anyone to help run the household. But since then, I've been doing some thinking." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. "What kind of thinking?" "I've got a successful ranch, Eleanor. I employ 12 men and I'm hoping to expand next year. I entertain business associates, host gatherings for the neighboring ranches. I need a wife who can handle those situations, someone who can hold her own in conversation and make guests feel welcome. Someone with more spirit than you seem to have." Each word felt like a slap. Eleanor had spent her entire life being praised for a quiet, modest demeanor. Her father had always told her that men preferred women who knew their place, who didn't draw attention to themselves or speak out of turn. "I could learn," she said desperately. "I could try to be more outgoing." Tom shook his head. "It's not something you can learn, Eleanor. Either you have that kind of confidence or you don't, and honestly, I don't think you'd be happy either. Ranch life out here is isolated enough without being married to someone who makes you feel even more alone." Eleanor stared at her hands, fighting back tears of humiliation. She had traveled over 1,000 miles, spent nearly all her remaining money on the journey based on his promises, and now he was rejecting her as casually as if she were an ill-fitting dress he could simply return to the store. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered. "I have nowhere to go. No money for the return journey." Tom's expression softened with what might have been guilt. "I'll pay for your ticket back to Boston, of course. It's the least I can do, and I'll cover your hotel expenses until the next stage leaves." "When is that? End of the week? 5 days." Eleanor would have 5 days to sit in this hotel room. enduring the pitying looks of everyone in town who would surely hear about her rejection. The thought was almost unbearable. "I understand," she managed to say, though her voice was barely audible. Tom stood up. "I truly am sorry, Eleanor. You deserve better than what I can offer. There are plenty of good men who would appreciate your gentle nature." After he left, Eleanor remained in the small parlor for a long time, staring at the rough wooden wall and trying to comprehend what had just happened. Everything she had been taught about how to be a proper woman, everything she had believed about herself, had just been declared insufficient. Mrs. Patterson found her there eventually, her kind face creased with sympathy. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Tom's not a bad man, but he can be thoughtless sometimes." "It's quite all right," Eleanor said stiffly. "He was honest about his needs. I should be grateful for that. You'll stay here until the stage comes through?" Eleanor nodded. "He's arranged to pay for my room and passage back to Boston." "Well, that's something at least." Mrs. Patterson hesitated. "If you don't mind my saying so, dear, there are other men in these parts, good men who might see your worth even if Tom Mitchell can't." Eleanor managed a weak smile. "I think I've had quite enough of frontier romance, Mrs. Patterson. I'll be returning to Boston." But even as she said the words, Eleanor knew they weren't entirely true. Boston held nothing for her now. She had burned those bridges when she sold her father's few possessions to pay for this journey. The small amount Tom would give her for return passage would barely cover her travel expenses, leaving her to arrive in Boston with nothing but the clothes on her back and no prospects whatsoever. That night, lying on the narrow hotel bed and listening to the sounds of the saloon below, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what had gone so wrong. She had followed all the rules, done everything she had been taught a lady should do, yet it had all backfired spectacularly. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Hartwell began to wonder if perhaps the rules themselves were wrong. Daniel Reeves had been loading supplies into his wagon outside Morrison's general store when he heard the raised voices coming from the hotel across the street. He wasn't the type to eavesdrop, but living alone on a remote homestead had made him sensitive to any disruption in the usual quiet rhythm of Silver Creek. When he saw Tom Mitchell emerge from the hotel with the satisfied expression of a man who had just solved an unpleasant problem, Daniel knew something significant had happened. He had noticed the young woman's arrival that afternoon, of course. Everyone in Silver Creek had noticed. Word traveled fast in a town of barely 300 souls, and the arrival of Tom Mitchell's mail-order bride had been the subject of speculation for weeks. Daniel had caught only a glimpse of her as she entered the hotel, a small figure in dark clothing, moving with the careful precision of someone trying very hard not to be noticed. Daniel finished securing the flour sacks in his wagon and was preparing to head home when Mrs. Patterson emerged from the hotel, her usually cheerful face creased with concern. She spotted him immediately and hurried across the dusty street. "Daniel Reeves! Thank the Lord you're still in town," she called out. "I need to talk to you." Daniel touched the brim of his hat respectfully. Martha Patterson was one of the few people in Silver Creek who treated him with consistent kindness, never seeming to notice the long scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, or the way he favored his right leg when he walked. She had been running the hotel since her husband died in a mining accident 5 years earlier, and her practical compassion had helped many travelers through difficult times. "Mrs. Patterson, is everything all right?" She glanced back toward the hotel, then moved closer to speak more quietly. "It's about that poor girl, Tom Mitchell's intended bride. He just rejected her, Daniel. Sent her packing like she was damaged goods." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. He had never particularly liked Tom Mitchell, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly why. The man was successful and well respected in the community, but there was something about his casual assumption that the world should arrange itself for his convenience that rubbed Daniel the wrong way. What reason did he give? Said she was too quiet, too shy. Claims he needs someone more spirited for his social obligations. Tone. Martha's tone made it clear what she thought of that reasoning. The poor thing has nowhere to go. No money except what he's giving her for passage back to Boston. She's trying to put on a brave front, but I can see she's devastated. Daniel considered this. He had grown up with 3 sisters and had seen enough of the world to understand what Martha wasn't saying directly. A woman alone in Eleanor's situation faced very limited and mostly unpleasant options. If she was lucky, she might find work as a seamstress or washerwoman in some larger city, barely earning enough to survive. If she wasn't lucky, Daniel had seen too many desperate women make choices that destroyed their lives. "What did you want me to do about it?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. Martha studied his face carefully. "You're a good man, Daniel. Better than most give you credit for. And you're alone out there on that homestead of yours. Mrs. Patterson, just hear me out. I've watched you these past 3 years, how you treat people, how hard you work. You never cause trouble, you help folks when they need it, and you're more educated than half the men in this territory. That girl in there deserves better than being shipped back east like returned merchandise. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching a dust devil swirl down the empty street. Martha's suggestion wasn't entirely unreasonable. His homestead was thriving, but the work was hard and lonely. He had built his cabin large enough for a family, though he had never really expected to have one. At 32, he had resigned himself to bachelorhood, assuming that most women would take one look at his scarred face and damaged leg and decide they could do better elsewhere. "I don't know anything about her," he said finally. "She might not want to marry a stranger any more than she wanted to marry Tom Mitchell. But you wouldn't reject her for being shy, would you? You of all people understand what it's like to be judged for things you can't control." The words stung because they were true. Daniel's scars came from a grizzly bear attack during his first winter in Montana. He had been lucky to survive, but the experience had left him marked in ways that went deeper than the physical damage. He knew what it felt like to see people's expressions change when they looked at him, to watch women avert their eyes, and find reasons to end conversations quickly. "Even if I was interested," he said carefully, "she might not be, and I wouldn't want to pressure someone who's already in a difficult position." "Of course not. But would it hurt to meet her? Just to see if there's any possibility of compatibility?" Daniel found himself nodding before he had fully decided. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to meet her." Martha's face brightened immediately. "Wonderful. Why don't you come by tomorrow afternoon? I'll arrange a proper introduction." After Martha returned to the hotel, Daniel remained by his wagon for several more minutes, wondering what he had just agreed to. The logical part of his mind catalogued all the ways this could go wrong. The woman, Eleanor, Martha had called her, was clearly from a different social class, educated and refined in ways he was not. She might be horrified by the isolation of his homestead, or disgusted by his appearance, or simply uninterested in trading one unwanted arranged marriage for another. But there was another part of him, a part he usually kept carefully buried, that whispered about warm conversations by the fireplace on long winter evenings, about sharing the small daily triumphs and struggles of homestead life with someone who might understand and appreciate them. About not spending another Christmas alone with only his books and his memories for company. Daniel climbed onto his wagon seat and started the long ride home, but his thoughts remained in town with a young woman who had traveled 1,000 miles only to be told she wasn't enough. That evening, as he prepared his simple dinner of beans and cornbread in his solitary cabin, Daniel tried to imagine what Eleanor Hartwell might be feeling. Embarrassment, certainly. Fear about her uncertain future. But probably also anger, though she might not admit it even to herself. In his experience, gentle people often suffered the most from rejection because they blamed themselves for not being what others wanted, rather than questioning whether those others were worth pleasing in the first place. He thought about Tom Mitchell's reputation around Silver Creek. The man was successful, yes, but his success had come partly from his ability to charm investors and potential business partners. Tom was the type who could make conversation with anyone, who thrived on being the center of attention at social gatherings. Daniel could see how he might want a wife who could match that energy, who could serve as a social asset as well as a domestic partner. But Daniel had also observed Tom's treatment of people he considered beneath his notice. The Mexican workers at the mine, the Chinese laborers who built the railroad spur, the women who ran the smaller businesses in town. Tom wasn't cruel, exactly, but he had a way of looking through people as if they didn't quite exist. Daniel wondered if Eleanor had sensed that quality during their meeting, if she had realized that Tom's rejection might have been a blessing in disguise. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grass around Daniel's cabin. He spent the early hours doing his usual chores, feeding the horses, checking the fence lines, splitting wood for the fireplace, but his mind kept wandering to the afternoon ahead. What did one say to a woman in Eleanor's position? How did one express interest without seeming to take advantage of her desperation? By noon, Daniel had changed clothes twice, finally settling on his best shirt and the jacket he usually reserved for trips to Denver. He hitched his gentlest horse to the wagon and made the 2-hour ride to Silver Creek, arriving just as the afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows down the main street. Mrs. Patterson was waiting for him on the hotel porch, her expression a mixture of hope and anxiety. "She's agreed to meet you," she said without preamble. "But Daniel, you should know, she's been crying. Trying to hide it, but I can tell. She's putting on a brave front, but she's scared and hurt. I understand. Be gentle with her. She's not like the rough women you might be used to out here. She's been brought up to be a lady, with all the fragility that implies. Daniel nodded, though he privately wondered if Martha was underestimating Eleanor's strength. In his experience, it took considerable courage to travel across the country to marry a stranger, regardless of how desperate one's circumstances might be. Martha led him to the same small parlor where Eleanor had met Tom Mitchell the day before. Eleanor was seated by the window, her hands folded in her lap, wearing the same dark blue dress she had arrived in. When she looked up at Daniel's approach, he saw that her eyes were indeed red-rimmed, but her gaze was steady and direct. "Miss Hartwell," Martha said formally, "I'd like you to meet Daniel Reeves. Daniel, this is Miss Eleanor Hartwell." Eleanor rose and offered a small curtsy. "Mr. Reeves, Mrs. Patterson tells me you wish to meet me." Daniel was struck first by her voice, soft but clear, with the careful diction of someone who had received a good education. Then he noticed her eyes, a remarkable shade of green that seemed to shift from emerald to sage in the changing light. She was indeed small, as Tom had noted, but there was something in her posture that suggested resilience beneath the obvious vulnerability. "Miss Hartwell, thank you for agreeing to see me." Daniel remained standing until she resumed her seat, then settled into the chair across from her. "I hope you don't mind my saying so, but I heard about your situation with Tom Mitchell. I wanted to offer my condolences." A flush of color rose in Eleanor's pale cheeks. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Reeves, but there's no need for condolences. Mr. Mitchell was simply honest about what he needed in a wife. I'm grateful for his honesty." The words were spoken with dignity, but Daniel could hear the hurt beneath them. Even so, it must have been disappointing after such a long journey. Eleanor's composure wavered slightly. Yes, it was disappointing. They sat in silence for a moment, each studying the other. Daniel was acutely aware of how his scars must look in the bright afternoon light streaming through the window, but Eleanor's gaze didn't flinch or turn away. If anything, she seemed to be looking at him with unusual directness, as if she was trying to read his character in his face. "Mrs. Patterson tells me you have a homestead north of town," Eleanor said finally. "Yes, about 8 miles up the valley. I've been there 3 years now. It's good land, water rights, fertile soil, room to expand." "Do you farm or ranch?" "Both in a small way. I have a few head of cattle, horses, chickens. I grow what crops I can in this climate. Potatoes, corn, some vegetables. It's not a large operation, but it supports itself." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like honest work." "It is. Hard work, too, especially in winter. It can get quite isolated up there when the snows come." Daniel watched her carefully as he said this, wondering if the mention of isolation would frighten her. But Eleanor seemed to consider his words seriously rather than dismissing them. "I imagine isolation has its advantages as well as its challenges," she said. "Peace and quiet, time to think, freedom from social pressures." There was something wistful in her voice that made Daniel lean forward slightly.
"You sound as if you might find isolation appealing."
I might. Eleanor met his gaze directly. I'm not very good at social situations, I'm afraid.
"Yesterday told me that quite clearly. Tom Mitchell's opinion isn't the final word on your social skills, Miss Hartwell. He's looking for a particular type of wife, one who can help him advance his business interests. That doesn't make his requirements right or wrong, just specific to his situation." Eleanor studied Daniel's face with renewed interest. "You speak as if you know something about different types of situations." Daniel hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I do. I'm not the most social person myself, Miss Hartwell. These scars make some people uncomfortable, and my homestead doesn't offer much in the way of entertainment or sophisticated company. I'm looking for someone who would find satisfaction in a simple life. Someone who might appreciate quiet evenings and honest conversation over elaborate parties and social climbing." Eleanor was quiet for so long that Daniel began to worry he had been too direct. Then she asked, "What do you enjoy reading, Mr. Gile?" "Reeves?" The question surprised him. "Reading?" "Mrs. Patterson mentioned that you're educated. I wondered what books you might have." "I have quite a few, actually. Poetry, novels, some philosophy and history. I order books from Denver when I can afford them. What about you?" Eleanor's face brightened, for the first time since he had entered the room. "I love to read. My father and I used to discuss books together. It was one of our favorite pastimes. I've missed having someone to talk with about ideas and stories." For the next hour, they talked about books they had both read, debating the merits of different authors and sharing their thoughts on stories that had moved them. Daniel was amazed by Eleanor's intelligence and the depth of her knowledge. She had clearly received an excellent education, but more than that, she had the kind of curious, analytical mind that could take ideas and examine them from multiple angles. As the conversation progressed, Eleanor seemed to relax. The tension in her shoulders eased and color returned to her cheeks. She even smiled a few times, transforming her entire face and giving Daniel a glimpse of the warmth that lay beneath her careful reserve. When Mrs. Patterson finally interrupted to offer them coffee and informed them that dinner was being served in the main dining room, Daniel realized the afternoon had passed without his notice. He felt as if he had been given a rare gift, the chance to see beyond Eleanor's protective facade to the intelligent, thoughtful woman beneath. "Miss Hartwell," he said as they prepared to part company, "I wonder if you might be willing to take a drive with me tomorrow. I'd like to show you my homestead, if you're interested in seeing it." Eleanor hesitated, and Daniel could see her weighing her limited options. "You're very kind, Mr. Reeves, but I should tell you that I'm planning to return to Boston at the end of the week. I understand. But if you have the time tomorrow, I think you might find the countryside interesting, and it would give us a chance to continue our conversation." Eleanor looked out the window at the mountains surrounding Silver Creek, their peaks golden in the late afternoon sun. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I would like that very much." As Daniel walked back to his wagon, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Eleanor Hartwell was nothing like what he had expected. She was intelligent, thoughtful, and possessed of a quiet strength that Tom Mitchell had been too blind to recognize. Whether she might be interested in staying in Montana and building a life with a scarred homesteader remained to be seen. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel Reeves had something to look forward to. Eleanor woke before dawn on her third day in Silver Creek, her mind already churning with thoughts about the day ahead. Through her small hotel window, she could see the first pale light touching the mountain peaks that surrounded the valley. The sight should have been beautiful, but instead it reminded her of how far she was from everything familiar, how completely she had severed her ties to her old life based on the promise of a new one that had already crumbled. She dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a practical brown wool that had seen her through many difficult days in Boston. As she pinned her hair into its usual neat arrangement, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. The woman looking back at her had dark circles under her eyes and a pinched expression around her mouth. She looked exactly like what she was, a spinster past her prime, rejected by a man who had never even met her before, deciding she wasn't worth his trouble. But as Eleanor studied her reflection more closely, she remembered yesterday's conversation with Daniel Reeves. For the first time in years, perhaps in her entire life, she had spoken with a man who seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. He had asked her opinions about books, listened to her answers, even disagreed with her thoughtfully on a few points. When was the last time anyone had treated her ideas as worth discussing, rather than simply accepting them politely or dismissing them entirely? A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Hartwell, it's Martha Patterson. Mr. Reeves is here with his wagon." Eleanor gathered her shawl and reticule, checking once more to ensure she looked respectable. Whatever today brought, she was determined to face it with as much dignity as she could muster. Daniel was waiting beside a well-maintained wagon hitched to a gentle-looking bay horse. In the morning light, Eleanor could see his scars more clearly. A long white line that traced from his left temple down to his jawline, and the way he favored his right leg as he moved. But she also noticed things she had missed the day before: the breadth of his shoulders, the careful way he groomed both himself and his horse, the genuine warmth in his dark eyes when he smiled. "Good morning, Miss Hartwell. I hope you slept well." "Well enough, thank you. And please, call me Eleanor. Given the circumstances, I think we can dispense with excessive formality." Daniel smiled at that, helping her up onto the wagon seat with a steady hand. "Eleanor, then. And you should call me Daniel." As they drove north out of Silver Creek, Eleanor was struck by the dramatic beauty of the landscape. The valley stretched out before them, flanked by towering mountains whose peaks were already capped with snow despite the relatively mild September weather. The river that ran through the valley caught the morning light like a silver ribbon, and she could see cattle grazing in distant meadows. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "So different from Boston." "Do you miss it?" "Boston, I mean." Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I miss the libraries, the bookstores, having access to newspapers and new ideas. But I don't miss feeling like I was constantly being judged and found wanting." Daniel glanced at her with interest.
Was it that difficult?
"You have to understand, I was the daughter of a man who worked with his hands for a living, but I was educated beyond my station. Too refined for the working class, not wealthy enough for society. I never quite fit anywhere. Eleanor surprised herself by speaking so freely, but something about Daniel's quiet attention encouraged honesty. That sounds lonely. It was, especially after my mother died. She had a way of making our small apartment feel like a proper home, making our simple life seem dignified and worthwhile. After she was gone, it was just my father and me, and he had his struggles. Daniel didn't pry for details, but Eleanor found herself wanting to explain. He drank. Not violently, just steadily, drowning his disappointment with his life, I suppose. I spent my 20s caring for him, watching him fade away. When he died, I realized I had never lived for myself, never made a single independent decision about what I wanted from life. Is that why you answered Tom Mitchell's advertisement? Partly, but also because I was practical about my options. A woman alone with no family, no money, and no particular beauty or charm doesn't have many choices. Marriage seemed like the most dignified path forward. They had been climbing steadily as they talked, and now Daniel turned the wagon onto a narrower track that led toward a cluster of buildings nestled against a grove of aspen trees. Eleanor could see a substantial log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn, several smaller outbuildings, and fenced pastures where horses grazed contentedly. "This is it," Daniel said, and Eleanor could hear both pride and nervousness in his voice. Eleanor stepped down from the wagon and looked around with genuine interest. The homestead was clearly the result of years of hard work and careful planning. The buildings were well constructed and maintained, the fences were straight and sturdy, and everything had the look of prosperity without ostentation. "You built all of this yourself?" "Most of it. I had help with the barn raising, of course, and some of the heavier timber work. But yes, it's been my project for 3 years now." Eleanor walked toward the cabin, noting the wide porch with its carved railings and the flower boxes that someone, Daniel presumably, had built beneath the windows. The door was solid oak with glass panels that would let in plenty of light. "May I see inside?" Daniel opened the door and stepped back to let her enter first. Eleanor found herself in a spacious main room with a large stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and walls lined with bookshelves. The floor was polished wood, covered with hand-woven rugs, and everything was scrupulously clean and organized. "Oh my," Eleanor breathed, moving toward the bookshelves. "You weren't exaggerating about your collection. I ordered most of them from catalogs. It's one of my few extravagances." Eleanor ran her fingers along the spines, recognizing many titles and discovering others she had always wanted to read. There were novels by Dickens and George Eliot, poetry by Whitman and Browning, works of philosophy and natural science. It was the library of an educated man with wide-ranging interests and the curiosity to explore ideas far beyond his immediate circumstances. "This is wonderful," she said, and meant it. She had imagined frontier life as necessarily crude and intellectually barren, but this room proved that sophistication and learning could thrive even in the wilderness. Daniel showed her through the rest of the cabin. A well-appointed kitchen with a modern stove and abundant counter space, 2 bedrooms that were simply but comfortably furnished, and a small study where he kept his accounts and correspondence. Everything was clean, organized, and built to last. "The nearest neighbor is about 5 miles south," Daniel explained as they walked around the property. "The Hendersons have been here since before I arrived, and they're good people. There are maybe 8 families scattered through this part of the valley, and we help each other when needed. It's not complete isolation, but it's not exactly a bustling social scene either." Eleanor nodded, watching the horses in the pasture and listening to the quiet sounds of the countryside. "Do you ever feel lonely out here?" "Often," Daniel admitted. "Especially in winter when the snow can keep me from getting to town for weeks at a time. But I've found that being alone isn't the same thing as being lonely. I'm alone by choice here, pursuing something I've built with my own hands. That's different from being alone because the world has no place for you." The distinction struck Eleanor as profoundly important. She had been alone in Boston, surrounded by people who had no real use for her. Here, Daniel was alone by choice, master of his own domain and his own destiny. "What would you expect from a wife?" she asked suddenly, then blushed at her own directness. Daniel considered the question seriously. "Partnership, I suppose. Someone who would share the work and the decisions, who would find satisfaction in building something together, rather than just managing a household for someone else's benefit. Someone who could be content with simple pleasures, good conversation, books, the satisfaction of a day's work well done." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Everything Daniel described sounded like the life she had dreamed of but never dared to hope for. "What about children?" she asked. "I would welcome them if God blessed us with them, but I wouldn't consider a marriage unsuccessful without them. There are many ways to find meaning and fulfillment in life." They had wandered back toward the house during their conversation, and now Daniel gestured toward the porch. "Would you like to sit for a while? I could make coffee." Eleanor settled onto the porch steps, enjoying the view across the valley and the warmth of the late morning sun. When Daniel returned with 2 steaming cups, she accepted hers gratefully and took a sip. It was strong but not bitter, much better than the hotel coffee she had been choking down for 3 days. "Daniel," she said carefully, "may I ask what happened to your face and your leg?" Most people seemed to pretend they didn't notice his scars, but Eleanor had learned that direct questions were often kinder than polite avoidance. Daniel settled beside her on the steps, cradling his coffee cup in both hands. "Grizzly bear, my first winter here. I was inexperienced, careless, got between a mother and her cubs without realizing it. She charged before I even knew what was happening. How did you survive?" "Luck, mostly. The attack happened near enough to the Henderson place that they heard the commotion. John Henderson and his oldest son managed to drive the bear off and get me to the doctor in Silver Creek. Took months to heal properly, and I'll never walk quite right again. But I lived, which is more than most people can say, after tangling with a grizzly." Eleanor studied his profile, noting the way the scars had healed cleanly, and thinking about what it must have taken to recover from such an ordeal and continue building a life in the wilderness. "Were you afraid to stay here afterward?" "Terrified," Daniel admitted. "But I had already put everything I owned into this place, and I realized that running away wouldn't make me any safer. It would just make me a coward as well as a victim. So I learned to be more careful, more aware of my surroundings, and I stayed." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching clouds drift across the valley and listening to the peaceful sounds of the homestead. Eleanor found herself trying to imagine what it would be like to live here, to wake up each morning to this view and spend her days working alongside someone who valued her thoughts and opinions. "Eleanor," Daniel said finally, "I need to be direct with you. I know you're planning to return to Boston, and I understand why. But I want you to know that if you were willing to consider staying in Montana, I would be honored to offer you marriage." Eleanor's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "That's very kind of you, Daniel, but you hardly know me." "How can you be sure we would suit each other?" "I can't be sure," he admitted. "Marriage is always a risk, whether you've known someone for a day or for years. But I've seen enough to know that you're intelligent, kind, and stronger than you give yourself credit for. You've traveled across the country alone to make a new life. That takes considerable courage. And yesterday, talking with you about books and ideas, I felt more alive than I have in months." Eleanor stared out at the valley, her mind racing. Everything about this place appealed to her: the beauty, the peace, the sense of building something meaningful with her own hands. And Daniel himself was unlike any man she had ever known. He treated her as an equal, valued her mind as much as her domestic skills, and seemed to see strength where Tom Mitchell had seen only weakness. "What if I disappoint you?" she asked quietly. "What if I'm not as strong as you think? What if the isolation becomes too much for me? What if you disappoint me?" Daniel repeated. "Eleanor, you could never disappoint me more than Tom Mitchell disappointed you, and if the isolation becomes difficult, we'll find ways to manage it. We could visit the other families more often, take trips to Denver, invite people here for gatherings. A marriage should be flexible enough to change, as the people in it change." Eleanor turned to look at him directly. "And what if you change your mind about me? What if you decide you need someone more spirited, as Tom put it?" Daniel met her gaze steadily. "Eleanor, I've lived alone for 3 years. I know the difference between being lonely and being alone. If I wanted someone spirited and social, I wouldn't have built my life in an isolated valley 8 miles from the nearest town. I want someone who can find joy in quiet moments. Someone who can be content with books and conversation and the satisfaction of honest work. Someone who won't try to change me into something I'm not." The last words hit Eleanor with unexpected force. In all her years of trying to be what others expected, no one had ever suggested that they might accept her as she was without requiring her to become someone else. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Eleanor, I want you to know that whatever you decide, these 2 days have meant a great deal to me. You've reminded me what it feels like to have real conversation, to share ideas with someone who understands them. As they drove back towards Silver Creek that afternoon, Eleanor's mind was churning with possibilities and fears. The practical part of her knew that marriage to Daniel Reeves was probably her best option, perhaps her only real option. He was kind, intelligent, financially stable, and clearly willing to treat her as a partner rather than a subordinate. But beyond practicality, Eleanor found herself genuinely drawn to the life Daniel offered. The idea of waking up in that beautiful valley, of spending her days working alongside someone who valued her contributions, of having access to all those books and the time to read them, it was a future she could hardly dare to imagine. When they reached the hotel, Daniel helped her down from the wagon and walked with her to the porch. "Eleanor," he said softly, "whatever you decide, I want you to make the choice that will make you happy. You've spent too many years living for other people's expectations. This time, choose for yourself." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As she watched Daniel drive away, she realized that for the first time in her adult life, she was facing a decision that could actually improve her circumstances rather than simply preventing them from getting worse. That evening, as she sat in her small hotel room and tried to weigh her options, Eleanor found herself thinking not about the practical considerations, but about the moment that afternoon when she had looked out over Daniel's valley and felt, for just an instant, as if she was seeing home. The question now was whether she was brave enough to reach for it. Eleanor spent most of that night staring at the hotel room ceiling, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. Every time she began to drift towards sleep, another thought would jolt her awake. What did she really know about Daniel Reeves? What if his kindness was simply a front to secure a housekeeper and cook? What if the isolation of his homestead drove her to despair? What if she disappointed him once he discovered her limitations? But then she would remember the way he had looked at her when they discussed Dickens's portrayal of women, the genuine interest in his eyes when she offered her opinion on Whitman's poetry. She would think about his library, his comfortable home, the peaceful beauty of his valley. Most of all, she would remember his words. This time, choose for yourself.
When had anyone ever said such a thing to her? By morning, Eleanor had made her decision.
But first, she needed to understand her alternatives with complete clarity. After breakfast, she asked Mrs. Burker, Patterson, if she could borrow paper and ink to write letters. "Of course, dear."
Are you writing to family back east?
Not exactly. Eleanor settled at the small desk in the hotel lobby. I need to make some inquiries. She spent the morning composing 3 letters.
The first was to the headmistress of a girls' school in Denver, inquiring about positions for governesses or teachers. The second was to a women's boarding house in Boston that she remembered from her father's final days, asking about accommodation for working women. The third was to her father's former employer, asking if they knew of any positions for women with bookkeeping skills. When the letters were finished and sealed, Eleanor walked them to the post office herself. The postmaster, a middle-aged man named Frank Morrison, who also ran the general store, looked at the addresses with interest. "These going east, miss?" "2 of them, yes. 1 to Denver." "Mighty expensive, sending 3 letters at once. You sure you need all of them to go out?" Eleanor counted the coins in her reticule carefully. The postage would take a significant portion of her remaining money, but she needed to know what options actually existed for her. "Yes, I'm sure." As she walked back toward the hotel, Eleanor found herself studying Silver Creek with new eyes. It was a small town, but it seemed prosperous and well organized. The main street was wide and lined with substantial buildings. The hotel and saloon, Morrison's general store, a small bank, a doctor's office, a church, and several other businesses. People moved about their daily tasks with the easy familiarity of neighbors who had known each other for years. She stopped at the church, a simple wooden structure with a bell tower and stained glass windows that caught the morning light beautifully. The door was open, and she could see a middle-aged woman arranging flowers at the altar. "Good morning," the woman called when she noticed Eleanor. "You must be the young lady from Boston. I'm Sarah Henderson. My husband John and I have the ranch south of the Reeves place." Eleanor stepped inside the church, noting the hand-carved pews and the obvious care that had gone into creating this sacred space in the wilderness. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Henderson. Please call me Sarah. We don't stand much on formality out here." Sarah finished arranging the wildflowers and stepped back to admire her work. "I heard about your troubles with Tom Mitchell. What a thoughtless man, dragging you all this way only to change his mind." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. Word travels quickly in a small town. It does indeed. But I also heard that Daniel Reeves has been showing you around. Now there's a good man, if you don't mind my saying so. My John thinks very highly of him. Eleanor found herself curious about this outside perspective. How well do you know Mr. Bruce, Reeves? Well enough. He's helped us through some difficult times, and we've returned the favor when we could. When that bear attacked him his first winter, John and our boy David were the ones who found him and got him to the doctor. Thought we'd lose him for sure. He was torn up something terrible. Sarah's expression grew serious as she continued. But I'll tell you something about Daniel Reeves. Most men, after going through something like that, would either run back east or turn bitter and mean. Daniel did neither. He just got more careful and more determined. Built that homestead into something to be proud of, and he did it mostly with his own hands. It is impressive, Eleanor agreed. More than impressive. And he's done it all alone. Which seems such a waste to me. A man like that should have a family, should have someone to share all that work and accomplishment with. Sarah gave Eleanor a meaningful look. Of course, that's not really my business to say. Eleanor spent the rest of the morning walking around Silver Creek, talking with various shopkeepers and residents. Everyone seemed to know about her situation, which was embarrassing but also oddly comforting. In Boston, she had been invisible, someone who moved through the world without leaving much impression on anyone. Here, people noticed her, spoke to her, seemed genuinely interested in her well-being. At Morrison's General Store, she struck up a conversation with Frank Morrison's wife, a plump, cheerful woman named Alice, who managed the store's fabric and household goods section. "You're lucky Daniel Reeves has taken an interest in you," Alice said as she showed Eleanor a selection of calico prints. "He's one of the finest men in the territory, but he keeps to himself mostly." We were all beginning to wonder if he'd ever find someone suitable. "What makes you think I'm suitable?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. Alice studied her for a moment. "Well, you're clearly educated. Anyone can see that in how you speak and carry yourself. But you're not putting on airs or looking down your nose at us simple folk. And yesterday, when you were talking with Mrs. Patterson, I heard you asking thoughtful questions about the town and the people, like you were actually interested in fitting in rather than just passing through." That afternoon, Eleanor found herself back at the hotel porch, watching the daily rhythms of Silver Creek life and thinking about Alice Morrison's words. Was she actually interested in fitting in? 3 days ago, she would have said she was simply trying to be polite while enduring a temporary embarrassment before returning to her real life. But now, sitting in the warm autumn sunshine and watching children play in the street while their mothers chatted on the sidewalks, Eleanor realized she was studying this place as a potential home rather than a temporary refuge. Mrs. Patterson joined her on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts, dear. I'm trying to decide what to do with my life," Eleanor said simply. "That's never an easy decision. But I will say this. You look more alive today than you did when you first arrived. Color in your cheeks, spark in your eyes. Whatever you're thinking about seems to agree with you." Eleanor considered this observation. Mrs. de Pickenham, beginning on top of, "Patterson, may I ask you a personal question?" "Of course, dear." "Do you think I'm too weak for frontier life? Too fragile?" Martha Patterson laughed out loud. "Child, you traveled over 1,000 miles by yourself to marry a stranger. You've been rejected and humiliated. Yet here you are, calmly walking around town and making conversation with neighbors. If that's weakness, I'd like to see what you consider strength. Tom Mitchell said I was too shy, too retiring for his needs." "Tom Mitchell is an ass," Martha said bluntly. "Pardon my language, but there's no other word for it. He wanted a wife who could impress his business associates, someone decorative and charming who would make him look more successful. There's nothing wrong with being that kind of woman, but there's also nothing wrong with being the kind of woman who prefers books to parties and meaningful conversation to social chatter." Eleanor sipped her coffee and watched a wagon full of supplies rumble down the main street. "Daniel says I should choose for myself this time. Smart man, that Daniel, and he's right. What do you want, Eleanor? Not what you think you should want, or what would be practical, or what would make other people happy. What do you actually want?" The question hung in the air between them. Eleanor realized that in 24 years of life, no one had ever asked her that question so directly. "I want to matter," she said finally. "I want to feel like my thoughts and opinions are valued, like the work I do makes a difference to someone. I want to wake up in the morning with purpose instead of just existing until bedtime comes around again." "And what about love?" Eleanor felt her cheeks grow warm. I've never experienced romantic love, so I don't know what I'm missing. But I think I could be content with partnership and mutual respect, especially if it came with genuine affection and shared interests. All of which Daniel Reeves seems prepared to offer. Yes, Eleanor admitted. All of which he seems prepared to offer. That evening, Daniel returned to the hotel as promised. Eleanor was waiting for him on the porch, and she could see the nervous anticipation in his expression as he climbed the steps. Eleanor, have you had time to consider my proposal? I have. Eleanor stood up, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. Daniel, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same woman who arrived on that stagecoach 3 days ago. That woman was trying to become what Tom Mitchell wanted, trying to fit herself into someone else's idea of the perfect wife. I don't want to make that mistake again. Daniel nodded slowly. What are you saying? I'm saying that if I accept your proposal, it will be as myself, Eleanor Hartwell, with all my quirks and opinions and stubborn ideas. I won't try to pretend to be someone more sociable or more domestic or more anything than I actually am.
And I need to know that you're accepting me as I am, not as someone you hope I might become.
Eleanor, Daniel said earnestly, I wouldn't want you to be anyone other than exactly who you are.
That's what I've been trying to tell you. Eleanor took a deep breath. In that case, yes, I would be honored to marry you. Daniel's face broke into a smile that transformed his entire appearance, making the scars fade into insignificance. Are you certain? It's a big decision, and there's no shame in taking more time to think. I'm certain. I wrote some letters today, investigating other options, and I realized while I was writing them that I was only doing it because I thought I should explore alternatives. But my heart wasn't in any of those possibilities. My heart is here. Daniel stepped closer, taking her hands in his. Eleanor, I promise you won't regret this decision. I'll spend every day trying to prove myself worthy of the trust you're placing in me, and I'll try to be the partner you deserve, Eleanor replied. Though I should warn you, I have very strong opinions about how books should be organized, and I refuse to cook beans every night just because they're practical. Daniel laughed, a rich, warm sound that Eleanor realized she was already beginning to love. I think I can manage those requirements. As they stood on the hotel porch in the gathering twilight, Eleanor felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a warm cloak. For the first time in her life, she had made a choice based on what she wanted rather than what others expected of her. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Tomorrow, she would begin planning a wedding and a new life. But tonight, she simply enjoyed the unfamiliar sensation of being exactly where she wanted to be, with exactly the right person beside her.
When would you like to have the ceremony? Daniel asked.
Eleanor considered the question. Soon. I don't see any point in a long engagement, and frankly, I'm eager to start our life together. That would give us 3 days to make arrangements. Perfect. Eleanor squeezed his hands gently. I'll send a telegram to cancel my return passage to Boston. As Daniel walked back to his wagon, Eleanor remained on the porch, looking up at the star-filled sky above Silver Creek. 3 days ago, she had been a rejected mail-order bride with nowhere to go and no prospects. Now she was an engaged woman with a future that actually looked bright. Sometimes, Eleanor reflected, the best things in life came not from following the expected path, but from having the courage to step off it entirely. The morning of Eleanor's wedding dawned crisp and clear, with the autumn aspens on the mountainsides showing their full golden glory. She stood at the window of her hotel room, watching the sun paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold, and marveled at how much her life had changed in just 1 week. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor, dear, are you ready for visitors? Mrs. Caretown, Patterson's voice called softly. Eleanor opened the door to find Martha Patterson and Sarah Henderson, both carrying packages and wearing broad smiles. We come bearing gifts, Sarah announced, bustling into the room. A bride needs proper preparation for her wedding day. Eleanor was touched by their kindness. In Boston, she had had no close female friends, no one who would have thought to help her prepare for such an important day. You're both so kind, but I'm afraid my wardrobe is quite limited. I have only the one decent dress, and it's rather plain for a wedding. That's where we come in, Martha said, unwrapping her package to reveal a length of beautiful ivory silk. This came in on yesterday's supply wagon, and it's exactly your size. Alice Morrison stayed up half the night altering it for you. Eleanor gasped as Sarah shook out the most beautiful dress she had ever seen. It was simple in design but elegant, with long sleeves, a fitted bodice, and a skirt that would sweep gracefully around her ankles. The silk was lustrous and soft, clearly expensive. I can't possibly accept this, Eleanor protested. It must have cost a fortune. Nonsense, Sarah said firmly. This is what neighbors do for each other. Besides, Daniel Reeves has helped every family in this valley at one time or another. We're happy to help him get properly married. Martha produced a second package containing delicate lace gloves and a short veil that had belonged to her own daughter. Emily wore this when she married last spring in Denver. She insisted I bring it for you. For a moment, Eleanor was too overcome with emotion to speak. These women barely knew her, yet they had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure her wedding day would be special. It was a generosity of spirit she had rarely encountered in her life. Thank you, she managed finally. Both of you. This is more kindness than I could have hoped for. Over the next hour, the two women helped Eleanor dress and arrange her hair. Sarah proved to have a surprising talent for hairdressing, pinning Eleanor's auburn locks into an elegant arrangement that framed her face beautifully. Martha carefully adjusted the veil and stepped back to admire their work. "Oh, my dear, you look absolutely radiant," Martha breathed. Daniel won't know what hit him. Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. The ivory silk brought out the warmth in her complexion and made her green eyes seem to glow. But more than the beautiful dress or the elegant hairstyle, there was something different in her expression, a confidence and happiness that had never been there before. "I feel different," she said wonderingly, "like I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be." "That's what a good marriage does," Sarah said wisely. "It doesn't change you into someone else. It helps you become more yourself." The wedding was set for 2 o'clock in the afternoon at Silver Creek's small church. As Eleanor walked down the main street on Mrs. Patterson's arm, she was amazed to see how many people had gathered to witness the ceremony. It seemed like the entire town had turned out, along with families from the surrounding ranches and homesteads. "Word spreads fast around here," Martha murmured as they approached the church steps. "Everyone's curious about the bride who was smart enough to choose Daniel Reeves over Tom Mitchell." Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness as she saw the crowd, but then she noticed Daniel waiting at the altar, and her anxiety melted away. He was wearing a dark suit that emphasized his tall, broad frame, and his hair had been carefully combed. When he saw her, his face lit up with such obvious joy and admiration that Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. The Reverend William Foster, a kindly man in his 60s who had ministered to Silver Creek for over a decade, began the ceremony with words about the sacred nature of marriage and the importance of partnership in facing life's challenges. But Eleanor barely heard the traditional phrases. She was too focused on Daniel's steady presence beside her, on the way he looked at her, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When it came time for the vows, Daniel turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his steady grip. "Eleanor," he said clearly, "I promise to cherish you as my partner and my friend. I promise to value your thoughts and respect your independence. I promise to work alongside you to build a life we can both be proud of. And I promise to love you, not for who I might want you to become, but for exactly who you are." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the personalized vows. When it was her turn, she found her voice steady and strong. "Daniel, I promise to be your true partner in all things. I promise to share your burdens and your joys. I promise to support your dreams and to trust you with mine. And I promise to build a home with you where both of us can flourish." When Reverend Foster pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel's kiss was gentle but thorough, sealing their union before God and their community. The congregation burst into applause and well-wishes, and Eleanor found herself surrounded by smiling faces and hearty congratulations. The reception was held at the hotel, where Mrs. Patterson had organized a feast that must have required the cooperation of every woman in town. There was roasted beef and chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from local gardens, and 3 different cakes. A fiddle player had been recruited from among the miners, and soon the hotel's main room was filled with music and dancing. Eleanor was touched by how many people approached her to offer welcome and support. Alice Morrison presented her with a set of kitchen linen she had embroidered herself. The doctor's wife gave her a collection of medical herbs and remedies. Even Tom Mitchell appeared at one point, looking somewhat sheepish as he offered his congratulations and best wishes. "I hope you'll both be very happy," he said to Eleanor. "I think Daniel got the better end of this arrangement." Eleanor studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity. But Tom seemed genuinely regretful about his earlier behavior. "Thank you, Tom. I think we both found exactly what we needed." As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found herself relaxing into the celebration in a way she had never been able to do at social gatherings before. Part of it was Daniel's steady presence at her side, the way he included her in every conversation and made it clear that her opinions were valued. But part of it was also the genuine warmth of the community, the sense that these people were truly welcoming her as one of their own. rather than judging her performance as an outsider. When the sun began to set, Daniel leaned close to her ear. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Reeves?" The sound of her new name sent a thrill through Eleanor. "Yes, I think I am." The wagon ride to Daniel's homestead, their homestead now, was magical in the fading light. The mountains were silhouetted against a sky painted in brilliant oranges and purples, and the first stars were beginning to appear. Eleanor sat close to Daniel on the wagon seat, her wedding dress carefully arranged around her, feeling more content than she had ever imagined possible. "No regrets?" Daniel asked quietly as they turned onto the track leading to the cabin. "None," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "What about you?" "Any second thoughts about your shy retiring bride?" Daniel chuckled, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of their home. "Eleanor, after watching you hold your own in conversations with everyone from the doctor to the miners today, I think Tom Mitchell's assessment of your social skills was rather lacking in accuracy." Eleanor considered this as Daniel helped her down from the wagon. "I think I was shy because I was always trying so hard to be what other people wanted when I can just be myself. Conversation comes much more easily. Then I hope you'll always feel free to be yourself with me." Daniel had carried her trunk and bags inside earlier in the week, and Eleanor was touched to see that he had prepared the cabin carefully for her arrival. There were fresh wildflowers in a vase on the kitchen table. Her few belongings had been arranged thoughtfully in the bedroom they would now share, and he had even moved some of his books to make room for the volumes she had brought from Boston. "It's perfect," she said, looking around their home with satisfaction. "Absolutely perfect." That evening, they sat together on the porch steps as they had during her first visit, but everything felt different now. This wasn't a tentative exploration of possibilities. This was home, the beginning of their shared life together. "What would you like to do first?" Daniel asked. "To make this place truly ours, I mean." Eleanor thought for a moment, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "I'd like to expand the garden next spring, and maybe rearrange the kitchen to make it more efficient for cooking." "What about you?" "I was thinking about adding a room to the house. Maybe a larger study where we could both have space to read and write. And I'd like to get a few more cattle, expand the herd." "Those sound like excellent plans," Eleanor agreed. "We'll have plenty of time this winter to make detailed preparations." As they talked about their hopes and plans, Eleanor marveled at how natural it felt to think in terms of we and ours. She had spent so much of her life as a solitary person, responsible only for herself and her father's declining health. Now she was part of a partnership, with someone who valued her input and wanted to build a future together. "Eleanor," Daniel said eventually, "I want you to know that you don't have to prove anything to me. You don't have to be anyone other than yourself. If you want to spend an entire day reading in the garden, that's fine with me. If you want to rearrange the furniture every week, that's also fine. This is your home now, and you should feel free to live in it however makes you happy." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes again. After a lifetime of trying to meet other people's expectations, the freedom Daniel offered felt almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more to me than you could possibly know." Later that night, as Eleanor lay in their shared bed listening to Daniel's steady breathing beside her, she thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 1 week ago, she had been a rejected mail-order bride with no prospects and no hope. Now she was a married woman with a home, a partner who respected and valued her, and a future full of possibilities. She thought about the letter she had written to cancel her passage back to Boston, and how liberating it had felt to burn that particular bridge. Boston represented her old life, the life where she had tried to be small and invisible, and grateful for whatever scraps of affection or opportunity came her way. This life, this marriage, this beautiful valley, this represented the courage to claim what she actually wanted, rather than settling for what seemed safe. As sleep began to claim her, Eleanor smiled into the darkness. Tomorrow would be her first full day as Mrs. Daniel Reeves, and she could hardly wait to see what adventures it would bring. For the first time in her life, the future looked not like something to be endured, but like something to be embraced with both arms. In the months and years that followed, Eleanor would often think back to that first night in her new home, and remember it as the moment when her real life finally began. She had traveled 1,000 miles and risked everything on the promise of a stranger's letters, only to discover that the greatest journey wasn't measured in miles at all, but in the courage to become who she was truly meant to be. And in Daniel's arms, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of their valley home, Eleanor Hartwell Reeves finally found the place where she belonged.